All right, so if you have your Bibles tonight, let's turn to Matthew, I think it is. And we're going to look at a passage it's Matthew 27. Look at a passage and just let you think about that, and then we'll actually think about it as we look at this box, the first quote tonight. And I would say for those of you who see this online at a later date, if you would like the notes from this, we're going to probably put them together, and you would be able to call our church office, and that information is online, and you can get the outlines for this as well, and that'll be available for you. Tonight, the name of the lesson, or the title of the lesson, is The Crushing Blow. And you would think, well, wow, after 70 A.D., you would think, what's left to crush? I mean, they've destroyed the temple. They've pretty much just demolished the city. Only a few of the towers are left. So how could they deal another blow? Well, the fact is, even though at first many of the Jews were not allowed back into the city, in time this was relaxed somewhat. It was mainly Romans in the city, and the 10th Legion is going to be stationed in the city. It's going to be their home for quite a while, for decades. And so the Jews, though, do live in Judea, what the Romans and the Persians, of course, called Palestine. And they're from where Jesus was from Galilee, which is up in northern Jerusalem, all the way down to the southern part of Judea. And so there's still a Jewish population there, and they're still thriving. Well, not thriving, but they're still there, and they're still, making it and living their lives day to day in a Roman province, more or less. But they're still there. The city's still called Jerusalem, and there are some slow things happening in the city, but not what you would think, and we'll get into that in just a few moments. But in Matthew 27, we've been reading from the Olivet Discourse the last 3 weeks, but I want to give a final reading from the Olivet Discourse tonight. And this is, well, actually, no, this is not from the Olivet Discourse. This is from, I chose this for a particular reason, you'll see, but this is from Pilate before the crowds at the crucifixion, before the Jewish crowd. And so at chapter 27, beginning at verse 22, Pilate said to them, that is to the Jews, because they have asked Pilate, who has offered them one of the two, Jesus or Barabbas, and they have said Barabbas. That is the Jewish people. They want a criminal to be released rather than Jesus. Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? They all said, crucify him. And he said, why? What evil has he done? But they kept shouting all the more, saying, crucify him. When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves. And all the people said, his blood shall be on us and on our children. That's a really bad thing to say, isn't it? I mean, even if there's any doubt, you wouldn't say that. And yet that's what these people say. And I read that to tie it to this introduction from Mark Goodman's book, Rome and Jerusalem. He said, neither its antiquity nor its deep wealth nor its people spread over all the habitable world, nor yet the great glory of its religious rites were sufficient to prevent its ruin. Think about that. All that they had. Think about what Paul says in Romans. He tells them, he rehearses before the Jews all the advantages that they had. And yet, they're in ruin. Josephus laments the destruction of the temple. It would be hard to overestimate the impact of this cataclysmic event on all Jews, wherever they lived. In practical terms, those most affected were the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and especially the priests who had served in the sanctuary. But the religious significance of what had happened was equally great for diaspora Jews who had never had an opportunity to visit the temple while it stood. In the last century of its existence, the temple had been at its most magnificent. We talked about this last week. It was more magnificent during Herod's time than it was during Solomon's time. A symbol of God's glory and protective care for Israel. If God, ruler of the universe, had allowed his temple to be destroyed, the explanation must lie in the sins of the Jews. Interesting statement. This is not a religious book this is coming from. This is a secular book. But this was the idea and the attitude that many of the Jews took once again, because they understood why the temple was destroyed the first time. So in the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD was terrible for the Jews, yet there were still Jews left in Judea and around Jerusalem. Now tonight we're going to look at the less known fall of Jerusalem in 135 AD. This rebellion is known as the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, and it went on for 3 years from 132 to 135. And what we're going to do is we're going to survey the time from 70 AD up until this time, about 60 to 65 years of history, to figure out, once again, what is going on as in God's providence. Not only will Jerusalem be destroyed again and renamed, but the Jews will be completely driven from the land of Palestine. All of them. Now, in the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem, we said last week that at first Titus did not want to destroy the temple. And yet, because of the dogged opposition that the Jews put up, even inside the temple was set ablaze, at first accidentally, but then Titus decided to let it burn, and then, as we said last week, he built these towers and all the equipment and tools that he would need to take the temple down block by block and completely destroy it. Now, this was not usual Roman policy. And when we think about the providence of God, I think it's somewhat interesting to think about that. This is not Roman policy. And again, I'm telling you this not from the perspective of somebody who wrote a commentary. I'm telling you this from the perspective of three writers in particular that are writing from a secular point of view. Even when these shrines or temples of other peoples were destroyed by accident, in almost every case, Rome themselves would rebuild the shrine or the temple. Because remember this, what I said last week, one of the things that insulted the Romans the most was that the Jews began to refuse them the right to go in to their temple and offer sacrifices. And they were highly insulted, because what the Romans thought is that they would take the primitive religions of other peoples, and they themselves would go in and help raise them up to higher worship. Yes, it is a syncretism of sort. But the Russians, I don't know where that come from. The Romans, there's been a lot about the Russians lately, but the Romans, I think that's what the Russians are going to do to Ukraine before it's all over. But the Romans already did that to Israel without nuclear weapons. Titus decided to turn the narrative on the temple's destruction. Instead of saying it's an accident and it should be rebuilt, he presents it as a rebellious enemy and their religion that had to be defeated. So there's no regrets in his narrative. There's no regret about destroying the temple and not allowing the temple to be rebuilt. This is a big deal. The Romans will not allow the temple to be rebuilt. As you know, we've talked about this before, and I want you to look at the addendum now. When Rome would win great victories, they would have their triumph, their parade. So in the parade after the fall of Jerusalem and Masada, Rome has its triumph, and what happens is that Vespasian and Titus are going to lead, And so they gathered the armies, and Josephus says the armies began to gather in their battalions and in their companies way before sunrise. And as they gather, they're ready to march, and Vespasian, the emperor, addresses them. He prays prayers of invocations. Titus prays prayers of invocation, and then the triumph starts. And in the triumph, they have all the spoils. And listen to what he says. The spoils in general were borne in promiscuous heaps, but conspicuous above all stood out those captured in the temple at Jerusalem. These consisted of a golden table, many talents in weight, and a lampstand likewise made of gold, but constructed on a different pattern from those which we use in ordinary life. It's the menorah. Affixed to a pedestal was a central shaft from which there were extended slender branches arranged trident fashion, a wrought lamp being attached to the extremity of every branch. Of these there were 7, indicating the honor paid to that number among the Jews. After these, and last of all the spoils, was carried a copy of the Jewish law, Torah. Then followed a large party carrying images of victory, all made of ivory and gold. Behind them drove Vespasian, followed by Titus, while Domitian, who was not involved, as we shall see, rode beside them in magnificent apparel and mounted on a steed that was itself a sight. The triumphal procession ended at the temple of Jupiter Capitolonius, on reaching which they halted, for it was a time-honored custom to wait there until the execution of the enemy's general was announced. This was Simon, son of Gioras. Remember, we talked about him last week, how that when they finally came together, they made him the commander. Well, now he's really glad all that happened. Who had just figured in the pageant among the prisoners, and then, with a halter thrown over him and scourged, meanwhile, by his conductors, he had been haled to the spot abutting on the forum, where Roman law requires that malefactors condemned to death should be executed. After the announcement that Simon was no more, and the shouts of universal applause which greeted it, the princes began the sacrifices which had been duly offered with the customary prayers. They withdrew to the palace. Some they entertained at a feast at their own table, for all the rest of the provision had already been made for banquets in their several homes. For the city of Rome kept festival that day for her victory in the campaign against her enemies, for the termination of her civil dissensions, and for dawning's hope of felicity. This is for the Romans and the pagans, as we talked about Sunday morning, when they see Paul in prison, they not only think they have defeated the Jewish people, they think they have defeated the Jewish gods. Now, usually, again, the Romans did not like to insult gods. Even though they felt superior, they felt their gods were superior, if indeed they really believed all of that, but at least they believed it in front of everybody. Remember Socrates. They just didn't have it in them to insult deities, except for the Jews. Don't you find that interesting again? So there's much more about this triumph that Josephus writes for us, but the bottom line is this: Vespasian and Titus made a mockery of Jewish religion, and not just the Jews in the empire, or not just the Jews in Judea, but all of the Jews, the Jewish people, were insulted and mocked. Afterwards, a temple tax, you remember the Jews in Palestine paid a temple tax every year. It was actually voluntary. Now it's required, not just of every Jew in Judea, but every Jew in the Jewish empire paid a temple tax of 2 drachma a year for the maintenance of the temples in Rome, and perhaps for building a pagan temple in Jerusalem in the future. Again, you can surely imagine how that goes over. Jews in Italy, Crete, Alexandria, and Cyrene began to riot and cause disturbances. The only Jews who were quiet were the Jews in Judea, because they'd had enough. The Jews were often incited by revolutionary leaders, some of them who had escaped from the very sect that was holed up in Masada, and others, and sometimes they would turn these people over to the authorities. Because again, many of the Jews, they're still the moderates and they're still the more radicals, but even throughout the empire, the more moderate Jews realized that the result of rioting would be that you would come under the heel of the Roman Empire. And they did. Thousands and thousands were killed. They killed hundreds and hundreds of people, the Jews themselves, in places like Alexandria and Cyrene. But then thousands of them were killed in retaliation. One thing I didn't say, but you think about this. Remember I told you last week that after he made pleas for the Jewish people to surrender, and they refused, King Herod Agrippa II went to Rome. Now you would think after the battle was over, and Rome has very tight control of Judea and Jerusalem, that he might want to go back and be king. The records really don't indicate whether he was offered this or not, but you would think maybe he was, but even if he was, he didn't go. Why wouldn't he go? Because there really wasn't that much to go back to at the time. He actually became a prefect, and his sister was the consort of Titus for about 10 years, although they never married. But it put Agrippa II in a good place. So here's a bullet summary of what has happened to this point to help us understand what's going on in the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Number one, the Romans make much of their victory over the Jews throughout the empire. Number two, the Jews who had carefully avoided the conflict with Rome were now having to pay a special tax which went to Rome and Roman temples. And furthermore, the Jewish people were now held in high suspicion by the Romans throughout the empire. There were people who were going on pogroms against the Jewish people, and many times they got away with it. They were confiscating their property and all the rest. It reminds you of what happened thousands of years later to the Jewish people. The Jewish people in the diaspora who had been living at this time somewhat peaceably, now there's just this general unrest and mood of anti-Semitism. Didn't start with the Nazis in the 30s, started way back with the Romans in 70 A.D. The Romans refused to rebuild or even allow the rebuilding of the temple. Now here's a statement. Later theological apologeticism, even enthusiasm for worship without sacrifices, this is from the Jews themselves, and simply the passing of time have deadened the response of modern historians to this ban. In other words, the Jewish people 2,000 years later, they don't really miss temple sacrifices. And in their theological apologetics of their particular kind, they've kind of erased the need for that, except for some strict Orthodox who see, in the future the rebuilding of the temple when they discover the red heifer, that kind of thing. So it's hard for us really to imagine when we interact, we read things that these Jews have written. Many of us know Jewish people. That's not a heartache for them that they don't have a place to sacrifice animals. But in antiquity, when it happened, it was outrageous. It was outrageous. How can they have a Jewish religion and a Jewish faith when there are no priests in Jerusalem offering up sacrifices? And there's no possibility that they will ever make a pilgrimage there and have a sacrifice offered for them personally. Even the Roman emperor said himself, I think this was Trajan, it was Domitian or Trajan, he said, except for Christianity, Roman religion and sacrifices was not so different from Judaism except in trivial matters. How you sacrifice, why you sacrifice, and that kind of thing. So here's where we are in the aftermath of 70 A.D. The next thing I want us to look at, and this is important because of how things develop, is the Flavians and the first two of the five good emperors, the Nerva-Antonine line. I think it was Gibbons who called the first five of the Nerva-Antonine emperors, I can't think of all of their names, the first three we're going to look at tonight, though, he called them the five good emperors. Actually, at the end of the line, there's Marcus Aurelius. He's in this line. And he was well respected. When Nero commits suicide or when he's killed, that was the end of the Augustan line. We talked about this last week when we compared the Herodian line to the Augustan line. Then there was the four emperors in 2 years, and then Vespasian becomes the emperor, and Vespasian is a Flavius, and so him and his two sons are known as the Flavian emperors. So Vespasian is the first of the Flavian emperors, and he is the emperor who had, you remember, been in charge of the campaign against Jerusalem until he went back to Rome to become emperor. And then after he becomes emperor, one of the first things he does is to once again send Titus to conquer and destroy Jerusalem and other strongholds around it. You can tell how bent they were on destruction, Vespasian, how bent he was. He sent, I think it was his cousin, it's Silvanus Flavius, or Flavius Silvanus, to destroy Masada. Masada is the place that Herod built for his own protection and safety that he could flee to. It's built on a rock that's way up in the air, with impossible to get to. They had trails on the backside, but they were easily defended. And so it was just a small garrison of Jewish people there with men and women. Probably, I think they said around 900 people. The emperor could very easily have just left that place alone, because to conquer that place was going to require a great deal of work. And if you know, most of us who don't know a lot about, or most people who don't know a lot about the history of Israel know about Masada, and because they're made movies about it, about how difficult it was to conquer, what a great triumph it was, because they built this huge earthen ramp leading up to Masada itself to batter the walls. The Jews had built an interior wall. They made quick work of that. I remember in one movie, and this is reported in history too, when the Romans, the second wall the Jews built on the top of Masada, the first wall was stone, the second wall was mostly wood, and the Romans set fire to the wooden walls, but the wind turned, and the wind was threatening the machinery of the Romans. And then the wind shifted, it blew away from their machinery and burned the walls. And of course, many of the Romans said, that's the providence of the gods. And many things did go against them, against the Jewish people like this. I'll tell you something else that is interesting to study, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it tonight, but is to read accounts, and Josephus has some of these, but to read accounts of the signs and wonders in the heavens that were going on just before Jerusalem fell in 70 A.D. That's pretty interesting. You say, well, it's these ancients and they're imagining things. Maybe so. Maybe so. Maybe not. So he made a mockery of the Jewish faith. This is Vespasian, yet he kept the veil and the golden stands at his palace. He had two sons, Titus and Domitian, and these three would comprise the Flavian rulers. So Vespasian dies in 79 A.D. He was pretty old. Titus takes over. He's pretty young, and he's the one who has Bernice that you see in the Bible. She's his consort. And it is expected by Vespasian, Titus was his favorite. Titus has been involved in military campaigns. He is a brilliant manager and tactician. And so Vespasian says, Titus he's going to rule a long time, and Rome's going to do really well. But sometimes you just don't know these things. In fact, Titus dies 2 years later at a young age of natural causes, they say. So in 81 AD, Titus dies, and Domitian, his brother, remember he was in the triumph, he takes over. He has no military experience, and that's something that he plans to correct. He was oppressive to both the Jews and the Christians. He went on many military campaigns to Germany, in the east. And under his reign, there were Jewish revolts across the empire. But again, they were crushed under his rule. He was a military emperor. He became very unpopular at home. And in 96, he was assassinated by some of his own military aides. There was no offspring. But the Roman Senate hated Domitian. He had become very tyrannical at the end of his life. He was very paranoid. He had killed his cousin that had helped him a great deal. He had other members of the family and members of the Senate all put to death. Even one of his father's most trusted military men, he had them all put to death. He became quite mad. And so he was assassinated, and the Senate wanted someone who had more of the disposition of Augustus, and so they chose a man by the name of Marcus Cocceius Nerva. He becomes known as Emperor Nerva because he was the Senate's choice. Although he was the Senate's choice, he was not the military's choice. And many times, as in the case of Vespasian, the military would choose who was going to be the emperor. Nerva also, to further kind of heighten his tensions with the military, he set about to reverse many of Domitian's policies, including his oppression of the Jews. He actually began to coin money that was holding out kind of a peaceful overtone to the Jewish people. He canceled the temple tax. He did many of these things, and many of the Jewish people said, wow, this is a really good thing. But in order to kind of cement his position, he adopted Trajanius, who becomes Emperor Trajan eventually, to be his son. He adopts him, but now Trajan had a father he was very close to, and his father was a very accomplished military man who had fought with Vespasian in the Jerusalem campaign. He didn't fight with Titus, but he had fought with Vespasian in the first part of that campaign. But by adopting Trajan, kind of set the military to rest, and so he's going along, but hopes for progress under this new emperor were soon to be crushed because he dies. He dies in 98 AD, and Trajan takes over for him. He becomes the emperor, and Trajan, whose father, again, fought with Vespasian, Trajan is very anti-Jerusalem, very anti-Jewish. And although he paid lip service to his adoptive father, his allegiance was with his natural father again, who had served with Vespasian. So soon the temple tax is reimposed, and the pressure on the Jewish people is intensified. And now this is going to include Jewish people in the land of Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Persia. I'm sorry, not Persia, but Iraq, because, and there is no modern-day Persia, and modern-day Persia is Iran, but Mesopotamia is, of course, Iraq, because that's the land of the Chaldeans, and the Parthians rule that, but Trajan campaigned against the Parthians, and he eventually conquers Mesopotamia, part of the Parthian Empire. And the Jews who have lived in Mesopotamia have lived in peace and have had religious freedom for hundreds of years, but especially those who fled there after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. They've been living there for 65 years with religious freedom, and now all of a sudden they come under the heel of Rome, and they're paying a temple tax, and they're being oppressed, and many of them are exiled. It came to the point where one group of civic leaders was asking the emperor, they said, the Jewish people should not be allowed to live here. We want to get rid of these Jewish people. And he said, look, I got nowhere to send them. Nobody wants them. That's how dire it was getting for them. So Trajan has a long rule. He's the second of the Nerva Antonine emperors. He dies in 117. He's killed in 117 with his troops in Cilicia during some of the Mesopotamian campaigns. And he had adopted his cousin, Aelius Hadrianus, to be his son and his successor. So again, you see how this goes. Hadrian is his cousin, but he adopts his cousin to be his son so that his son can be emperor when he dies. Hadrian's policy, it took him time to consolidate his power in Rome, and while he was consolidating, he wasn't doing a lot against the Jewish people, but once he had consolidated his power, in 129 and 130 A.D., Hadrian visited the eastern part of his empire, including Jerusalem. Maybe you've heard this story. But during his visit to Jerusalem, he proclaimed the city of Jerusalem that the name would be changed to Aelia, which is his first name, Capitolina. Capitolinus is a cult that worships Jupiter back in the Roman temples. And so he's going to name the capital city, or he's going to rename Jerusalem after himself and a cult of Jupiter worshipers from Rome. Plus, on the old Temple Mount, he had a large statue of himself placed there. Now you can just imagine this made him a very popular man among the Jews. Now the people of Judea, as I had told you a few moments ago, have been compliant to this point with the Romans, but now a new rebellion is about to begin. And this is where what is known as the rebellion of Shimon Bar Kokhba begins. And it's the last rebellion Israel will ever have against Rome. His name, Bar Kokhba, means son of the star. Many in his day considered him to be the Messiah, including the famous Rabbi Akiba. Bar Kokhba raised an army that's mostly a guerrilla force, and they're going to try to expel the Romans, not just from Jerusalem, but from Judea itself. And they begin to inflict heavy casualties on the Romans. It kind of goes back and it makes you think of the Maccabees, and then going forward it makes you think of how the Jewish people fared after the mandate in 1940. The mandate's in 46 or 48. 48. The mandate's in 48. And the leaders of Israel in 1948, they hearkened back. This was not lost on them. And they said, this is the first time there's an army in Jerusalem, an army in Israel, an army of Israelites to defend their own soil. The first time in almost 2,000 years. Again, that tells you the significance of this second rebellion. So the Romans eventually send 80,000 troops to put down the rebellion, and they encountered heavy losses. They said that when Hadrian addressed the Senate that he would say, blessed to you and well-being to your offspring and that kind of thing, the flowering invocations that leaders offer. They said when he went before the Senate to report on this war that he had nothing flowery to say. He got right down to business, kind of like Paul in Galatians. He was extremely distraught over what the Jewish people were doing. And again, he takes it personally. So they fought for 3 years. This army of Bar Kokhba. But in the end, he himself is killed, and the rebellion dies with him. If you consider how, we've talked about tonight, the ramifications of the first fall of Israel, the ramifications of the second fall are even greater than the first. Because the entire Jewish population in Judea, in what would become known as Syria, Palestine, and just Palestine, they're either killed. They had guys that were burying the bodies, and they have excavated caves there, and they were full of bones of young men. They either killed them, sold them into slavery. Another writer says that the slavery market in the Mediterranean Sea area that year, that the prices were depressed because there were so many Jewish slaves on the market. Think about that. Or, for a few of them, they were exiled. And people in other countries began to hate the Jewish people all the more. So Hadrian got exactly what he wanted because the city is renamed, and it stays that way for hundreds of years. But it had cost him a great deal. The modern Zionist movement, again, honors the memory of Bar Kokhba, but there is some controversy. For example, and again, it goes back to this, in the sovereignty of God. In the sovereignty of God, obviously, he wanted the Jewish people driven from Jerusalem and Israel. And he does it. For the Christians, Trajan was not a bad emperor. He certainly wasn't a good one. You remember his most famous line on the Christians is his letter to Pliny the Younger? When Pliny the Younger writes him and says, Sir, what should we do about these Christians? And Trajan writes him back a letter, and this letter's been captured. Actually, both letters have. And he says, well, if they behave themselves, pretty much don't mess with them. But if they insist, then they should be executed. And for the Christians, that's kind of a break. Hadrian was not particularly a terrible emperor against the Christians. Domitian had been a terrible emperor against the Christians. Many people think that the book of Revelation contains references to Domitian, because he was a very harsh emperor on persecuting Christians. But the entire Jewish population, again, is killed or sold into slavery or exiled. No one is left. So was it wise? Was it even benevolent to put a country through an unwinnable war? You have to ask yourself the question. And was the second tragedy greater than the first? In the first tragedy, they essentially lose the grounds of their religion. In the second tragedy, they lose their home completely. They have no stake. Think about this. They have no stake in Israel. And it is clear that despite social changes and the passage of time and history, these events are still relevant in today's world. So next week we're going to take up Jerusalem and its being conquered and contested through Islam. So we'll probably do about 3 more weeks on this. But again, I'm going to conclude the series as far as going back to references in the Bible to tonight, and then we'll go for a few more. All right? Thank you all very much.